So greetings, Professor, and thank you so much for making time and joining me.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for taking time to fly all the way from Rwanda to Nairobi, Kenya. This must be a great commitment and passion.
Indeed, indeed. And so when I was doing my homework, one of the things I realized is that all the podcasts that you do and all the speakings that you do, they are always 30 minutes and not more than that. Is there a specific reason as to why they're all 30 minutes?
Experience has now taught me that the attention span of the average person is just about 30 minutes. If you go beyond that, you begin to lose your audience. And it is always important to have your audience attention so that they don't go into a phase where they are no longer with you.
You are a really smart person and you know a lot about African history, and I can assume that when you are speaking, you have a lot of stuff to talk about. So how do you squeeze everything into 30 minutes?
It is important to realize what is important for an occasion, and that is what I call a sense of occasion. You don't say at a funeral what you ought to say at a wedding and vice versa. And you've got to give information in capsules in a granular manner so that people can consume the information. If you give an information overload, then it doesn't play its role and has little value.
And how does the retaining of information on your side look like? Because when you speak, you remember the dates, you remember the names, and it's just mind-blowing.
I don't think there is any trick to it, but I believe that the more one reads, the more one accumulates information and one deploys that information. That is a function of reading and reading keenly. Many people say they read, but they don't read keenly. On average, I read a single book 3 times. The first reading is simply to live through the book. The second reading, I now read a lot more keenly. The third reading, I now make notes. So that then ensures that what I read is retained in the inner recesses of my brain.
And it's so unfortunate that nowadays most young people don't read. And so we have a lot of young individuals who are not aware of their history, they're not aware of the continent and what's going on. And it's so unfortunate that young people are not really interested in politics, but at least right now we are seeing young people taking an interest. And an example of that could be what's happening in Nigeria, right? Young people taking to the streets because they believe that they had voted for Peter Obi and they believe that he should have been the president. And so the fact that he wasn't, them taking up on the streets and trying to have a conversation on what's going on, I think that's really inspiring. And it could also be inspiring to you because I believe that you're working on empowering young individuals to take an interest in politics and also to help the continent because it's this generation that would make changes.
Without doubt. And let me talk about reading. Reading is what irrigates your mind. Your mind needs to be irrigated, and it is through acquisition of knowledge, diverse forms of knowledge, that you irrigate and enrich your mind. And we must encourage our young men and women to do that. If you look at the history of Africa, if you look at the pre-independence history of Africa, or Africans both here and in the diaspora, you go to the 1900s and meet individuals such as Sylvester Williams of Trinidad and Tobago, Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, John Hendricks, and people like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., W.E.B. Du Bois in that part of the world. And you come to the continent and you meet individuals who are involved in the struggle for decolonization, such as Nkrumah, Nyerere, Kaunda, Modibo Keita, Samora Moises Machel, and you can name many of them, Ahmed Ben Bella, Agostino Neto. All these were individuals who read and wrote about their experiences. And they were young. When I look at the age of some of these individuals, they were spectacularly young, in their 20s. Patrice Emery Lumumba died at the age of 36. You would think he died at the age of 86. And if you look at the media that was available to them for purposes of communication, there was nothing. I saw recently a letter that was written to Kamuzu Banda by Kwame Nkrumah. It must have taken even a month for him to receive that letter, but they communicated. Today, communication is instantaneous. Your phone is in itself an instrument of communication to any person anywhere in the world. And which brings me to the question of the reemergence of this enthusiasm by young people in politics. Politics is what umbrellas everything. Economics is politics, food is politics, everything is politics. So therefore, one cannot afford the luxury of being apolitical. And if you look through the history of revolutions in any society, in the traditional African societies before the advent of the European, changes were brought about by young people, whether it was in the Oduduwa Republic, whether it was in Benin Republic, or the Buganda, or the Zulu, or whichever republic. And if you go even to Europe, look at the history of Europe, look at the more recent revolutions, it was young people. Look at the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and look at the ages of people like Vladimir Lenin, Trotsky. Look at the changes that took place in Turkey, which gave birth to the concept of the Young Turks. Look at the changes that took place in France in the 1960 through the student demonstration, the Tiananmen Square in China, the student activities in 1980 in Korea, the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, initially with people like Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe and then Nelson Mandela. Look at the Soweto uprisings in 1976. Look at the Arab Spring. So it is whenever young people rise that the society changes. Because for too long now, since we regained independence, we have allowed those who themselves took power, who when they were very young, don't want to leave office. So if you look at the average age of political leaders in Africa, it is almost in the 60s or 70s. Your octogenarians who have long lost their flavor are the ones who are ruling the roost. It therefore gladdens my heart when I see young people across the continent now going beyond just being voting machines, but questioning the political processes and participating in the political processes, whether it's in Nigeria or Ghana or Kenya or South Africa or Zimbabwe. I would love to see a lot more of that. And this is what gives meaning to people like Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, who said that if you want to change your society, you've got to invest in young men and women. And the same with Kwame Nkrumah, and the same with Samora Moises Machel. They believed in young people. And I have no faith that when, for example, now we talk about Africa Agenda 2063, or the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, who are going to implement this? It's young people. And they must be young people who are patriotic, young people who understand their circumstances, young people who have self-esteem. And when they are organized, there is no limit to what they can achieve.
And so they say a revolution is brought about by two reasons. Either when people start thinking and they say that we deserve better, or when they're hungry. Which one do you think is for African youth right now?
You know, Kwame Nkrumah used to say that people are telling us to wait for history to evolve. He said, no, we must inject a revolutionary favor in the wheels of history. And circumstances create revolution. It is not, you must not wait until you are hungry. You must not wait until you are angry and hungry. You must not wait for the iron to be hot. You must heat the iron so that it becomes hot. So you must be a master of your own destiny, and you must not allow situation to degenerate, because the changes are evolutionary and you've got to anticipate change. 2 weeks ago, over 2 weeks ago, I was listening to the Chinese when they were holding their National Congress, which brings together in Beijing 6,000 delegates drawn from the entire China. And it takes a whole year to prepare it. The Western press, who normally want to think that China is not saying anything positive, say it is a rubber stamp. No, it is not. Those fellows were engaged in serious discussion on how China is going to relate with the world 100 years from thence. So you cannot afford the luxury of thinking in circles of 5 years. You can break the implementation into circles of 5 years, but the thinking must be grand and intergenerational. And that is what I want to see. How are we going to deal with our economies? How are we going to earn the dividends of the fourth industrial revolution? How are we going to use and derive the benefits of artificial intelligence? How are we going to engage in smart agriculture? How are we going to engage in education? How are we going to engage in all the critical areas in our lives that are going to change the circumstances of this continent so that we are able to compete? We are talking about climate change. We are talking about clean energy. We are talking about all these things transiting from fossil fuel into what they call clean energy. Are we going to begin to make cars in this continent? Are we going to begin to make medical equipment in this continent? Are we going to begin to make furniture in a manner that can't be sold in this continent? Are we going to improve our textile industry? That requires forward planning. And that is what our current African governments are not concerned with. Because as somebody once said, Africa is full of politicians who are thinking of the next election rather than statesmen who should be thinking about the next generation. And it is the duty of young people to now apply pressure in an organized manner with the firmness and clarity that will open the eyes of these so-called leaders to ensure that Africa can compete with other civilizations wherever they are.
We have been speaking about leaders and politicians, right? And when you speak about leaders, some of the individuals that you usually mention who are up here include Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Nelson Mandela, and Patrice Lumumba from Congo. Yeah. Who is a leader to you and who is a politician? Are these two same individuals?
There is the tendency, particularly in Africa, that the mere occupation of public office makes you a leader. No. Leadership is a totally different thing. Leadership is about individuals who are capable of thinking about their societies and who are prepared to sacrifice for their societies without expectation of any return. I think the best description of who a leader was a description that I read in Carter G. Woodson's book, Miseducation of the Negro, that a leader is he or she who knows that he is not necessarily better than everybody else, but he has passion and commitment to provide direction in a manner that will help others and improve his circumstances and the circumstances of the society. A politician, on the other hand, is a parasitic individual who thinks he has the monopoly of knowledge and wisdom and whose grand agenda is to manipulate processes for personal benefit by hoodwinking the people that he or she is working for them, but he is simply massaging his ego and feathering his nest.
Back in the days, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, Africa had great leaders. It had leaders who really cared about the continent and they really cared about the welfare of their people. But right now, that doesn't seem to be the case. Where have we gone wrong in terms of cultivating the next generation of African leaders?
We lost the script at a certain stage. We lost the script when the political arena became an arena for acquisition of materials. So that today people join politics not to serve but to be served. They join politics because it is the shortest avenue to acquiring material wealth and also to enjoy impunity from the laws of the land. And we lost the script when gluttony became our creed and when greed became our creed and people are no longer interested in serving the continent but serving themselves. And the electorate also became susceptible to manipulation along ethnic lines, through corruption, and through other means which were not in the best interest of the country. But if you look at the first generation leaders, and we've mentioned quite a number of them, such as Kwame Nkrumah, such as Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Kenneth Kaunda, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, people like Samora Moises Machel, these were individuals who were prepared to sacrifice their all for the sake of their societies without expecting anything in return. And they saw politics merely as an arena for serving the motherland. We lost that crop of leaders, and what we now have are crooks Many of them are. Of course, there are few exceptions to the general rule, but the bulk of them, 90% of those who occupy positions of power in Africa today, have no interest in the continent of Africa.
And so how do we then cultivate a generation of leaders who are passionate about the continent?
You know, there is something that the former president of Philippines, Corazon Cojuangco Aquino, said, that when a society has no values, then what is called democracy is nothing but a confederacy of fools. And it is also said that the safety of your typical politician demands that the bulk of the people be kept in the most profound ignorance. How do we change our society? Through knowledge. When the people have knowledge and information, then they can make demands of those who are in positions of leadership. Many of young people and people in Africa have been lulled into a false sense of security. Koigi Wawamwere, a Kenyan politician and one-time activist, has written a book which I commend to Africans, although it is specifically about Kenya. It says, "Towards Genocide in Kenya, the Curse of Negative Ethnicity." And he says that your typical African politician is an ethnic warlord. And what he or she does is to hypnotize the population from his ethnic group by telling them that the other ethnic group is your enemy. And once they are hypnotized, then they are weaponized for the purpose of use and manipulation in the political process. In order, therefore, to liberate society, you must give people information. Because once people have information, then they are able to tell the difference between what is good and what is bad, and they are able to demand that their taxes be utilized for their benefit. And that is why education for young people is very critical. Not a accumulation of information. That is not education. Education must transform your mind and heart and enable you to make sensible judgments. Once we do that, we are going to change societies. And we saw it in the Arab Spring. We saw it in the End SARS movement in Nigeria. And it can still be done if you educate, and it must be done. And some of us are crusaders in that particular journey by trying to ensure that we remove the wax from the ears of young people, we remove the scales from their eyes so that they are capable of seeing things as they ought to be seen.
Do you think democracy works for Africa? And I'm asking this question because some of individuals like Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah, like individuals who wanted good things for their people and their nations, they ended up being removed from the positions of power. And most of the times, it's usually the West who are doing that. And we can all agree that conflict is a huge industry, especially for Western countries, right, when it comes to Africa and taking resources from the continent. Should Africa have a different governing system?
First of all, let us understand the state and status of the post-colonial African state. These are neo-colonial states which were created with the intention that they should not function. I urge you and your audience to read a book written by Adekeye Adebajo, The Curse of Berlin, Africa After the Cold War. The Berlin Project was one of the most diabolical projects ever undertaken against any people, dividing us into little countries, and how some given to France, who now call themselves Francophone, some given to the Portuguese, now call themselves Lusophone, some given to the British, calling themselves Anglophone, and complete with organizations which have been created deliberately to ensure that those divisions are alive and well. So it is true that governance system is manipulated. People like Kwame Nkrumah were overthrown through the machinations of the United States of America and the United Kingdom. Patrice Emery Lumumba was also assassinated and removed from power through the machinations of the Americans and the Belgians. And we know many of them have been the victims of this kind of manipulation. Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara was removed through Blaise Compaoré, through the activities of France. We know all these. And they do that because they want to have their puppets in place. And that is the reason why some of us believe that a Pan-African and a united Africa will make sure that we are not susceptible to the activities of these diabolical imperialists. So, which brings me to the question that you've asked, democracy. What is democracy? I mean, the thing that we call democracy has been exported to us and embraced to us means that we have multi-party elections, that we have periodic elections. I no longer use the word democracy, I use the word governance. And I have no doubt in my mind that Africa needs to rethink governance. Governance that will ensure that the people are involved in electing the people who serve them, a governance that will ensure that we have structures of accountability for those who have the honor and privilege of serving their people. If we do that and use whatever term that we want, not necessarily democracy, will create systems that are sustainable. You will have noted in many African countries, immediately after the elections, then there is conflict. Because we have created a system where those who win the elections or those who lose the elections can't agree. Those who lose the elections will always claim that the elections were rigged or stolen. So this idea of creating a political system which is conflictual is not in the best interest of Africa. Africa must rethink, and there must not be any one size fits all. What will be suitable in Nigeria may not necessarily be suitable in Ghana. It may have its own nuances, but there is one golden thread that must pass through it, that the people must be involved in determining who are going to serve them. Once we do that, then we will have an Africa where there is sustainable and sustained leadership that will ensure that the continent grows politically, economically, and otherwise.
How can we achieve Pan-Africanism in our current age?
No, we are going to achieve it. Sometimes I think we judge ourselves too harshly. The post-colonial African state is just slightly, the oldest, which is Ghana, is just slightly over how many years? 60 years.
60 years.
Yeah, so that is very young. So the struggle must continue. And now I'm beginning to see, as I travel across the continent, the anger and the urge to eliminate the things that divide us. Eliminate visas. You don't need them. Eliminate boundaries. Ensure that trade flows, that I'm able to take a bus from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to Dhaka in Senegal, from Cape Town in South Africa to Cairo in Egypt. Once you allow people to move freely, once you allow goods to move freely, once you allow the airspace to be open, and you will be surprised. Under the aegis of the OAU, now the African Union, we have all these declarations and protocols. The Yamoussoukro Declaration on freeing the airspace, the Kigali Agreement on eliminating boundaries and having free movement of peoples. All these things are there. And what we need to do, therefore, is to implement. I said at another forum that Africa must now stop making any declaration, must now stop making anything, must now stop symposia and workshops and seminars, and go into a 5-year implementation of the declaration that we have made, so that when we meet, we simply meet for the purpose of assessing how far we have implemented. If we do that in 10 years, you'll be amazed what is happening. You'll be amazed at what can be achieved. It can be done. And I, in my mind, have a structure which I think would serve Africa well. Let us have a confederal government. A government that has a center whose only agenda is to ensure that we have one military. We need military strength. The law of the jungle still reigns in this world. The Americans say they are strong and bully us simply because they have a strong army. So we must have a single army. We must have a single currency. We must have coordinated foreign policy. We must have the things that make a state. Then the single units can now govern themselves. They can do policing and all those things. It can be done. This is a Swiss model which will be given a completely African flavor. And once we do that, and it is your generation that must work at it. I get annoyed when I get to borders in African countries and somebody asks me, how long are you going to be here? And I'm in Namibia. Why should I be asked? I should be in Namibia as long as I want, as long as I can demonstrate that I have the capacity to take care of myself. But this is colonial hangover, which we must get rid of for the sake of this continent. That is the only way we are going to compete with Europe. That is the only way we are going to compete with the Chinese. That is the only way we are going to compete with the Americans. That is the only way we are going to trade with them from a position of strength, not from a position of weakness. And I'm happy that Africans are beginning to realize that this unity is critical going forward.
It is, because when you look at it, it's like individual African countries are trying to fight with the United States, with the United Kingdom, with China, which is it's impossible.
You know, Nyerere put it very well in the 1960s, says that when you put the United States of America in the same ring with Lesotho, and you expect that the rules will be the same and it will be a fair fight. He said, even in boxing, Nyerere said, you don't put a featherweight with a heavyweight. It is no longer a match, it is murder. So in order for Africa to play at the heavyweight level, let it be one, so that we have a single ambassador in the United States of America. You imagine that we have only one single ambassador in the United States representing the whole of Africa. People will begin to say, yes, these are people to be respected. When we say that we want a seat in the Security Council, we will be respected. When we have a single currency, we'll be respected. Today, if I want money to be transferred from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania to Nairobi, the money first goes to a correspondent bank in New York before it comes back. We cannot continue to function like that. And the time is now for us to raise our voices and to raise an army of young men and women, an army of intellectually empowered young men and women whose intellectual firepower is going to be deployed in a positive manner for the sake of this continent. It must be done.
And speaking about having a United States of Africa, I think now is even a perfect time, right? Because when you think about technology, now you have digital nomads, right? Young people who can work from anywhere, really. And right, so if you have visa-free policy and they just need their passport to be able to travel and they don't need work permit, that could be way easier for them to be able to travel across the continent.
And one of the things that we must also do is to ensure that these are given meaning. You imagine we had a single passport, that you don't have to carry a Tanzania or Rwandese or Congolese passport. You simply have an identity which shows that you are from the territory called Tanzania, from Kenya, from Rwanda. So you show it at the border and you have a single currency. If you carry 20,000 afros, we know that is going to make you happy in Ghana. Then we don't have to worry. Then the conflicts that you now see in Tigray, in South Sudan, in Cameroon, those conflicts will simply begin to disappear. Of course, conflict never quite disappears, but they'll be of the kind that we can manage, and then we can begin to engage in serious trade. The technology is now such a great enabler that we must use it in a positive manner. And I have no doubt that if we do so, we are going to create a continent that is worth its weight in the international scheme of things. It can be done, and we need crusaders for it. I'm very unhappy with the African Union, the way it is structured now. It is weak. It is financed from outside. It doesn't have its agenda. It is lukewarm. It doesn't deliver. It is a toothless bulldog. And it is our duty to use that instrument because it already exists. I think it can be revamped so that it also has a leadership that is composed of crusaders, not bureaucrats who want to wear designer suits and look good. And the other thing, of course, is language. One of the things that we must do is to now give a pride of place to Kiswahili.
And that is what Nyerere tried doing back in Tanzania, right? Because we had like 120 tribes.
Yeah,
and
wow.
so you needed a language that could unite everyone. And it also makes sense, Kiswahili, because it's also a Bantu language. It's been derived from most African languages.
From most African countries. Kiswahili lazima tukikuze.
Kabisa. Nakubaliana nayo. Ni kweli. One of the things that I admire is that your foundation has never received funding from any financer,
Yes.
right? And the reason to that, you said, it's because the moment you receive funding, they control what you say, they control the reports you write, they control what you do. And that has happened a lot across the continent, including in our medias, right? And we can see why we're hearing the stories that we're hearing. And every time people hear about the continent, they just think of hunger, they think of death, they think of AIDS, they can't think of anything positive. What does that say about the IMF and the World Bank?
You know, when the IMF and the World Bank were created in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in the United States, it was in 1944. None of the African countries participated in its creation. It was British and American economists, and it was specifically designed at that time during the rebuilding of Europe, the implementation of the Marshall Plan. And when we regained our independence as African countries, were then grafted into it, IMF and World Bank are economic enslavers. What they are designed to do is to ensure that we are in a perpetual state of debt. You can never get out of IMF and Bretton Woods institutions, generally because they want to ensure that they control your economy, and when they control your economy, they control your politics, and when they control your politics, they control you, and when they control you, they bring in military bases, and when they bring in military bases, they determine who governs you, because if you don't play ball, they are going to instigate the armies to overthrow you, because in any event, African armies want to be trained in Sandhurst, they still want to be trained in the United States of America, so their world view is still dictated by those foreign powers. What we must do as a continent is to use our institutions for purposes of financing our affairs. The African Development Bank was going to be such an engine, but you now know that it has almost 88 shareholders. The second largest shareholder is the United States of America. Japan has shareholding. The United Kingdom has shareholding. France has shareholding. They have seized and captured and paralyzed African Development Bank. It is only African in name. And as they say, he or she who pays the piper calls the tune. Even this sanction that you see being deployed against countries such as Zimbabwe is because we don't have Pan-African institution. And one of the things that I hope that African Union will begin to do, particularly when we are going to celebrate 60 years since the creation of the OAU, now AU, in the 23rd, 24th, and 25th days of May in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, is to rethink how we finance our affairs. African Union itself is almost 70% financed from outside. Financed even by NGOs such as GIZ and Roll Wallenberg Institute and European NGOs. And what they do is they simply tell you, if the agenda is climate, they tell you to go to climate. If the agenda is human rights, now the main agenda is LGBTQI. They tell you, if you don't behave, we are going to cut aid. And dead aid, Dambisa Moyo, Zambians Dambisa Moyo talks
Economist,
about dead aid. And Greg Mills talks about why Africa is poor and what Africa can do about it. I think that should look at these books and what they have written in terms of research very keenly. There's a good book which has been written by the Korea Ha-Jun Chang called The Bad Samaritans. And in The Bad Samaritans, he actually specifically talks about and against the IMF and its activities in the continent of Africa and in Latin America and elsewhere, and arrives at the conclusion that as long as we are dependent on IMF and World Bank, our economies are simply going to be shadow economies of the American economy or the Russian economy or the Chinese economy or the British economy or the European Union economy. And the time is now. Latin America at a certain stage, Chile and Argentina actually, and Brazil, succeeded in weaning themselves off the breasts of the IMF and World Bank. We must now do it. If we don't, you'll be amazed. And even at a small level, we can make all these organizations irrelevant. Danida, SIDA, or this little organization. We tell them we don't want your money. They give you $100,000, they think they own you and own your future generation. They ask you to write report every week, and they proceed from the premise that you are a thief. You are stealing from them anyway. You have no independence. Your dignity is lost. So today, through my foundation, now we want to raise funds, but only from Africans. I believe
possible
that there are African millionaires and billionaires who, if we are able to persuade them that we are going to do a good job, should be the ones that are going to finance and fund us. Not George Soros or Bill and Melinda Gates or Tony Blair Institute. These are neo-colonialists whose only agenda is to control us and to manipulate us. And when they sit, they look at us and say, oh, these God-forsaken people.
And you can see why they react so aggressively when individuals like Sankara said we are not taking loans, or even Magufuli, who believe you admire.
John Joseph Pombe Magufuli demonstrated, and I had several meetings with John Joseph Pombe Magufuli, and he said, we are going to finance our activities through the taxes that we raise, and indeed, the Julius Kambarage Nyerere hydroelectric power was financed almost exclusively through Tanzanian resources. The gas from Mtwara to Dar es Salaam, the same thing. The SGR, almost the same thing. It can be done. And he demonstrated that it can be done. And John Joseph Pombe Magufuli is one person who said, I'm not even going to attend these useless meetings.
And he never did.
And he never did. He said, we have our embassies in those places. What is the work of our ambassador? Thomas Isidore Sankara said in 1987 at the meeting of the OAU, at that time, he said, we should even stop paying the debts. In any event, we deserve reparations for slavery. We deserve reparations for colonization. And if we take a joint decision as Africans that we are not going to pay debts, what will they do to us? Will they nuclear bomb us, all of us? So they need, and Thomas Sankara was right, that in order to liberate yourself from some of these things, some element of methodical madness is necessary.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It is. And he understood the danger that came with saying that.
Of course.
Because he told them if they don't join him, he won't be back in the next meeting.
Absolutely. And he knew. Thomas Sankara actually knew. And he said he knew who was planning his murder, and he knew it was his best friend. And he said, if it is him, I have no defense.
Let him betray me, but I won't do that.
And you've got to have something like that. Not these individuals. Now you see the African leaders saying, oh, they agree with what I've been saying all along, that they should not all 54 of them be summoned to Europe and America. But you wait, during the coronation of Charles, they'll once again be trooping to London, and they'll be herded into buses again. Then they'll come back and complain. So you must treat yourself with respect if you want to be respected.
And I think one of the things that aid does is take away that respect and dignity from the people, because you don't give them an opportunity for them to be able to work on themselves and do their own work. And at the same time, you make them dependent on you such that when you come, when are you leaving? Well, I'll be here. I'm here to stay, right? Which means that, and the problem is most of the times the problems that such foundations try to solve, they're never solved. If it's water problem, there would always be water problem as long as the foundation exists.
But how can you kill the goose that lays the golden egg? If it is poverty that feeds you, and poverty and conflict in Africa are multi-billion-dollar industries. The conceptual West wants an Africa that is poor and is in a perpetual state of conflict. Because that's how they supply guns.
And that's how they
weaponry.
Get minerals.
That is how they then take minerals for free. That is how they offload their harvests for their grains, which they don't need. whether it's Ukraine or the United States of America. That is how they are now controlling our seed, Syngenta and Monsanto. They don't want our traditional seeds. They want us to buy seeds every season, so they control our food chain. That is how the Chinese are now exporting tilapia to us. So we've got to really rethink. Sometimes it pains me when I see the possibilities and how our electoral process is hostile and toxic to the good men in this world. Good men and women are unelectable in most of Africa.
Unfortunately, that's the case.
Because the electorate is also poisoned, it is ethnicized, it has been made corrupt. The only stimuli that it responds to is ethnic and monetary. So when you come with ideas, they say this one does not know what he's talking about. Somebody said that the typical African electorate thinks about what he called the stomach infrastructure. And once you take care of the stomach infrastructure, he or she thinks about nothing else. Tragic. And that is why young men like you and others must now go out into the rooftops and say, no more, no more. We've got to liberate ourselves from these chains. And it is being done. You look at young Chinese, young Koreans, young Vietnamese. They love their countries. But what is happening to our young people, because the political environment has been poisoned by selfish politicians, our young people are dying in the Mediterranean Sea, which has become a graveyard for young Africans in pursuit of the very elusive El Dorado, the land of gold. We must stop it.
And Africa, I'm thinking about it. Africa has a massive potential, such that if we are to say we are going to lock the continent and we have to produce everything that we are consuming, the question is, who is going to suffer? It definitely won't be us.
It is the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
And I mean, Africa has built the world throughout the ages. Africa built Europe. Africa built America. Africa built Australia. Africa is building China. All the resources. You go to Europe today and you see the gold, the copper, the electricity, everything. It is from Africa. And that is why they came here and enslaved us. That is why they came here and took our minerals. That is why they are still coming here. Because Africa is the continent that has fed the world. When we talk about the mother continent, we are not simply talking about the mother continent to the extent that she feeds our own children, but she feeds the world.
And the world knows that.
And the world knows that. That's why she cannot be allowed to be free. And that is why she must wake up. And she can only wake up when her sons and daughters wake up. And we are not saying that when she wakes up, she's not going to feed the world. She will. But she will do so on her own terms and with dignity. But throughout history, Africans have been dehumanized, have been humiliated. And that is what we must stop.
And Africans have been made to feel inferior too.
Of course. It was a long thing. Kwame Nkrumah said it very well, that regaining political independence is the easiest. The most difficult is going to be dealing with this psychological impact where you are made to believe that you are inferior. You can see, even as we talk, and I've said it many times, we are taught to hate ourselves, to hate our names, to hate our character, to hate our color, to hate our things, so that even now, when we do things in matters as mundane as football, we still are attracted to European football. Even our tastes, we are made to hate our food. So we acquire a taste for Kentucky Fried Chicken. We acquire a taste for McDonald's. We acquire a taste for Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola. We lose taste for cassava and gari. and mandazi. We must regain our taste and appetite for our own things and lose appetite for Kentucky Fried Chicken. We must lose appetite for Coca-Cola. We must lose appetite for Pepsi. We must lose appetite for Tarino. We must lose appetite for Fanta.
And I think that starts with you loving being an African and loving the
Absolutely.
African continent. Who is an African to you?
An African is primarily an individual in whom the mother continent is born. Primarily, he would have the brown or dark complexion, but that is not the only test. I know Africans who now have different shades of color, and that is why I can't agree more with the Osagie Kwame Nkrumah. You are not an African because you are born in Africa. You are an African because Africa is born in you. In fact, there was a great debate in Africa about Africa and Africans in the 1960s. Is the color of the skin the only test for being an African? And it was settled. It is the primary test, but it's not the only test.
Yeah, because if you say it's the only test, then you exclude the North Africans.
Absolutely.
And why have the North Africans been left out as Africans?
They have left themselves out. And I think it is only in the recent past. If you look at the early leaders of the people that are called Arab, they were very conscious of their Africanness. If you listen to people like Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, they were conscious that although they are of Arab stock, they were primarily Africans, because the Arabs only occupied that part of the world in the very recent past. That was a Negroid area, Egypt and the entire Maghreb. People like King Hassan of Morocco were Africans, and they recognized that fact. People like Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia recognized that. People like Ahmed Ben Bella recognized that. People like Mokhtar Ould-Daddah of Mauritania recognized that. But we have a group of people who are confused. When it is convenient, they are Arabs. When it is inconvenient, they are whites. And the current president of Tunisia is a racist who doesn't understand himself and has not embraced the spirit of Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia. So that is one of the struggles that Morocco, of course, is confused. At one time, they even left the African Union and wanted to join the European Union, and they were excluded. So there is some work to be done up there to remind them of the spirit of the founding fathers of their nations, and I've already mentioned them: Gamal Abdel Nasser, Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, Hassan of Morocco, and Ahmed Ben Bella and of course President Bouteflika in Algeria, also in the recent past, also demonstrated that he was a committed Pan-Africanist.
And even individuals like Muammar Gaddafi, they're on the front line of creating...
Indeed, even Muammar al-Gaddafi, who himself is of Berber stock, demonstrated, and he indeed was one of the major drivers of this Pan-Africanism until the Obama administration eliminated him.
Because he was pushing for a single currency.
Absolutely.
If we are to achieve a single currency and a single passport and visa-free travels, when do you think this will take place?
I think it is achievable, in my view, if there is commitment within the next 10 years.
10 years?
I think so. Let's be, particularly when you talk about a single currency, there are certain fundamentals that must be put in place. So I would be one who would want the fundamentals to be put in place. The West Africans tried to do it in the context of the ECO, which was then hijacked by the French. In the East African community, we even had a deadline. We ought to have had a single currency by the year 2014. We lost that. We now claim we are going to have it in 2024. It won't happen. So there are certain fundamentals which, if put in place, I give it a maximum of 10 years, but I believe we can work a little bit faster on the question of free movement of people. Once we deal with border issues and issuance of identity cards, that can even be done in the next 5 years, because within East Africa it's already achievable. Within SADC is already achievable. Within West Africa under ECOWAS is already achievable. The only problem we have is in Central Africa. But if we do that and we have a commitment and a plan of action, then it can be done. And that is why I'm disappointed with the AU. After in Nkosazana, Dlamini Zuma left, and we have the gentleman called Faki. There's been no movement in the things that are Pan-African. We have had Awuda Nepad, nothing to write home about. Africa Agenda 2063, not much to write home about. And now the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which came into force in 2021, and I believe that there is work to be done. But we must have a sense of urgency. The sense of urgency that the Osage for Kwame Nkrumah demonstrated on 24th of May, 1963, it must happen now. And if it doesn't happen now, then we must be angry with ourselves. It can't be done.
It can't be done. 10 years, that's not a long time.
It is a very short time.
It's a very short time.
When you are dealing with the lives of nations, it's a very short time.
Absolutely, and it will change a lot of things.
Let me tell you, look at intra-African trade now. At the very best, it is not more than 25%. At the very best. You know, if we change that to be 85%, how many jobs would be created? You'd create jobs in the hundreds of millions. China succeeded in pulling up 800 million from poverty within 30 years. We can now make it shorter because we can learn from the mistakes that China made.
Yeah.
We are a market of 1.4 billion. If you can put the purchasing power, we have our currency called the Afro, and you ensure that the per capita income of every African is 1,000 Afros. And you then ensure that they are spending, that we are the tourism sector. People are visiting the island of Goree. People are visiting the stone houses in Zanzibar. People are going to Monomotapa and all those things, Swakopmund in Namibia. Then internal tourism itself, you'd have nearly 200 million moving within the continent and spending money within the continent. Textile industry. We are no longer importing shoes. We are no longer importing from Italy. Beef, we are eating our own beef. Water, we are no longer buying Dasani. We are no longer buying Coca-Cola. We are buying our own drinks. You can imagine what that can happen. That we have all this fast food, but fast food, it is not Coca-Cola, it's not Kentucky Fried Chicken. It is Mahamri from Tanzania. Can you imagine? You know, sometimes when I think about those possibilities, people would be coming here.
They will.
Yeah. But we are exporting work. Now you see African countries saying that the only place where our young daughters can be employed is as slaves in the Arab world. Modern day slavery in United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain, in Brunei, Dar es Salaam, and in Oman, and in Saudi Arabia. And we call those jobs. We are training doctors in Nigeria, training doctors in Ghana, training doctors and nurses in Zimbabwe, and then we are sending them as finished products to work in the British health system, in the American health system, in the Canadian health system, in the Australian health system, while all the diseases that we thought we had conquered are now back with a bang in the continent of Africa. We are importing all our pharmaceutical products, yet the primary ingredients for those pharmaceutical products come from here. No African country is making phones. The best we are doing is assembling. We have no car manufacturing. We are importing batteries, and yet lithium is here.
Vast majority of it.
Coltan, the single most essential ingredient in a mobile phone, the Democratic Republic of Congo is its home. Lithium, you go to Zimbabwe now, you go to Zambia now, you go to Malawi now, you go to Somalia now. That is the home of lithium. So, sometimes when you think about it and you look at how narrow we are in agriculture, what can we not grow? In power generation, look at the Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo. What can it not generate? In solar energy, you go to Namibia, what can we not generate? You go to the entire Sahelian region, we can generate. And there is not a single African country that is making solar panels. You're importing them from Germany or Vietnam. Can you believe it?
It's hard to. And I was speaking to Kambale Musavani from Congo, and he said Congo alone can produce enough electricity to power the whole of the continent and food for the whole continent. Absolutely. A single country.
Yes, it can. Congo only.
Only Congo.
Tanzania can do so with 80% arable land, cashew nuts. Tanzania can supply the whole world. Malawi can supply us with onions. Nigeria can do that. Ghana can do that. I mean, you can go country by country. You know, we are sleeping on our talents.
I am glad you're in Africa, and I'm glad you're in Nairobi.
I'm glad that I am in Africa and that I am an African.
Because most of the times, if you look at some of the most powerful intellectuals in the African continent, unfortunately, most of them are not in the continent.
Yeah.
And they're teaching elsewhere.
Yes.
And it's like, that's African talent that you're exporting,
Yes.
which we need in the continent, because we surely do.
And there are many people, even within the continent now, there are many people who are quiet, but they are not being enabled. Our countries and our political class also have a duty to create an enabling environment. You young people who are now doing great work across the continent of Africa and went to leadership schools, you could be utilized in a better way. But your countries are not utilizing you. You are now going out of your way and creating this opportunity. Suppose your countries were to recognize your talent and to put money into those talents, what can you not achieve? What can you not do that Zuckerberg and Bill Gates have done, or Tesla, or Elon Musk? You can.
We have the market.
You have the market, and you have the know-how, and you have the passion.
And the resources are there.
And the resources are there, and we must enable you. If African countries were simply to say that we are going to take only 2% of our GDP to enable young men to go into startups, you would not be running to Europe and America writing proposals to be given 50,000 bob. You would be getting it here.
Here.
Only 2% of the GDP. If all African leaders, thieving leaders and politicians were to return all the money they have kept in Panama and in Guernsey, and we give them a moratorium for only 1 year, that money could push the GDP of Africa by 1 trillion United States dollars.
Professor, we spoke a lot about education. One of the books I've read is Frantz Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Masks, right? And it explains a lot about the psychology of superiority complex and inferiority complex. So this is something that people have researched about and they have written about, but we are still suffering the effects of it right now without people knowing that there are such resources that they can utilize to understand why they're in the position that they are right now. What should be done in the education system in the continent?
I was in Zanzibar about a week ago, and the young man who was taking me through the ancient constructions in the old town said something that I thought was spectacularly ingenious. He told me, this church where we are is the Anglican church in Stonehouse, where there was a whipping post. They needed the church so that they could soften your hearts and soften your minds. Then he took me to the school, and they needed the school so that they could indoctrinate you. Then he took me to the hospital. He said they needed the hospital so that once, if you got sick, you would be made well. And once you are well, then you would be exported as a commodity to go and work the fields. I thought that was amazing. The way he interpreted it. Education, the ones that we inherited, was meant to indoctrinate us. So that our default way of thinking, we think like white people. We think the way they do. Because remember, the education was supposed to create a graduate who would work in their civil service for their benefit, not our benefit.
Not our
And
benefits.
Nyerere said it in 1966, that education must not be an avenue for accumulation of certificates
That you can hang in the wall.
that you can hang on your wall. No. Education must turn you inside out so that you become a good instrument for social revolution and societal change and transformation. And I am afraid that the education system that we are still working on in many parts of Africa are creating a very small class of individuals whose greatest claim to fame and pride is that I went to Oxford, I went to Cambridge, I went to Yale, I went to Stanford, I went to Harvard, I went to the Sorbonne, I went to Lisbon. You never hear them saying, I went to the University of Nigeria at Nsukka, I went to the University of Ghana at Legon, I went to the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. No, they want to be the alumnus of Yale, not The alumnus of Anta Cheikh Diop University. In fact, if you ask them, do you know that there is a university called Anta Cheikh Diop in Senegal? Or Eduardo Mondlane in Maputo in Mozambique? They do not know.
The question is, do they even know there's someone called Sheikh Anta Diop?
No, they don't. Many of them don't. If you ask 10, they don't. Yet there is a philosophy called Diopism.
And yet we think Africans are not smart.
No, we are, but we have been made to wear blinkers. So we see in a tunnel, we are not curious. We don't allow them ourselves to use our intellect properly. We don't irrigate our minds. And remember, even the social media, which is the home of very many good things, if you look at the things that our African people on average are attracted to, they are not the things that build. They are the things that indoctrinate and destroy. Yet it has and creates an opportunity where we can use it in a major way. Even things that we use in the internet. Is it not time now that we should have our own TikTok equivalent?
There you go.
Yeah.
China did it.
Instagram equivalent.
WeChat.
Yeah, WeChat. Why? We must. Because these things that we now have and we are using from Europe and America, they can switch us off any minute.
They can.
Yeah,
and
all of us.
And the moment they do that, we're
Twitter,
disconnected.
they can switch us off completely. So we must be in control. We say I have 2 million followers on Twitter, but you can be switched off any minute
in a
and
second.
you have 0 followers. They can't do that to China. So these are, there is no shortage of opportunities. And this is the kind of conversation that I would want to hear in our parliament. Do you ever hear something like that? Across the continent? Nothing. You don't hear this conversation about agriculture, about pharmaceuticals, about artificial intelligence. No, when the time comes, what happens is that you get the British Parliament, Tony Blair Institute come here. They come with a standard piece of legislation. Parliamentarians are taken for a retreat and given 50,000 shillings or 50,000 CD or 200,000 naira or kwanza, and then they come and the law becomes law. They sign what we don't know. In order to accommodate their companies which are coming here.
What do you think of individuals like Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, who opposed the LGBTQ?
But of course, I'm quite clear. I thought that Ugandans did a very good job, but I'm very unhappy with President Museveni that he did not sign the bill quickly. I don't know what it is and why he has returned it to Parliament for scrutiny, but I hope that they not water down what is contained in that bill. Africa must speak with one voice and say that LGBTQ is something that we are not interested in. It is not our priority, and therefore don't tell us to do these things that are not our priorities, and we oppose them, and you can keep your money and we will not die because you did not give us the money. Clarity. As the Tanzanians say, gugumze, tafune maneno. We must say it clearly.
As how it is.
Yes.
And I think even for Museveni, it's not even about, either he accepts or rejects. It's just the fact that we have our own government and we can decide on our own.
Absolutely.
Because it goes back to dead aid, right?
Yeah.
We are giving you the aids. You need to agree this, agree to that, say no to that. And when he stands against them, you can see the reaction from them.
Then you see an American ambassador threatening our presidents. Can you believe it? Arrogantly telling our presidents what they should and should not do. So is it not latter-day slavery when you cannot determine what to do,
and
how to behave?
An ambassador.
Yeah, it's
not
an
even
ambassador.
The president.
Can you imagine a Ugandan ambassador, a Kenyan ambassador, or Tanzanian ambassador, or Lesotho ambassador in the United States of America as much as saying anything about a bill in the United States of America? No, you cannot. And it is because we ourselves have also allowed ourselves to be told things by people who ought not to tell us those things. And when you see your political leader being disrespected, it means that you are disrespected.
You are really disrespected. Professor, one last thing to African youth. What's your message to young people?
If Africa is going to change, it's going to change because young Africans have changed their minds and they have only one agenda that they want to achieve: to make Africa great, to make her great politically, to make her great economically, to make her great socially, to make her great in the arena of technology, and is only going to happen when young men and women take a solemn vow and say, we are going to change the continent of Africa, and we are going to do so recognizing that this is a long war which is intergenerational, and that we are going to say with Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, it can be done. I am playing my part.
It can be done. I am playing my part. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.